Now let's cut to the chase on the Indigenous Voice. Before Prime Minister Anthony Albanese released his draft amendments to the Constitution, the main argument from opponents centred on fears the Voice would be a third chamber, would be equal to Parliament, if you like, would have too much power. But as soon as the details about the constitutional wording came out, the opponents switched their argument to saying that they need to see the detail of any voice that the Parliament would legislate under the Constitution.
Quite frankly, I haven't met anyone who can explain it to me what the actual voice is. They usually get flabbergasted and don't know what to say.
Now, yes, I agree with Warren Mundine there and what the opposition is saying. We do need to see a draft bill at some stage, the sooner the better. But as I keep saying, there's already a 275-page report on what a voice would look like, and there's a declaration there. I was involved in the committee that did that work. But the main risk has always been delivering too much power in the Constitution. That's the controversy here. Everybody agrees that hearing from Indigenous people is a good thing. The argument is whether it should be in the Constitution. There's no worries about the legislation because Parliament can always change the laws. Only a referendum can change the Constitution. So to get some clarity on the proposed changes to the Constitution, I'm joined by constitutional law expert, Professor Anne Twomey from the University of Sydney. Thanks for joining us, Anne. I thought the first thing to do would be to go through the wording of the amendments as proposed by Anthony Albanese. Let's put the first one up on screen because this is what would go into the Constitution. The first point is there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Now, first up, all that says in the Constitution is that forever and a day, unless you change the Constitution, there's got to be one, right?
That's right. That's all it does. So that's the key thing, and the whole amendment is to try and make sure that the body permanently exists. Now, having said that, some people will point out there's another provision in the Constitution that says there shall be an interstate commission. And by the way, there isn't one. It's been got rid of for a long time.
Oh, now you're complicating it for me even further. Well, why is that the case?
I'm just going to explain there that's a distraction from the whole thing, because the reality is there's no constituency out there of people who want there to be an interstate commission, who are going to go to court and demand and say there needs to be one. And it was put into the Constitution, over 100 and something years ago, and, its role and purpose has been made redundant since then. So, but if we had a referendum putting this in now, we can say, hey, the Australian people in a referendum came out and voted and said, you shall have this. And that has the power of the people behind it, and that's why it's important.
And that's why the supporters like it, because it protects the fact that there needs to be one, and that's why opponents are a bit worried. If we look at clause number 2, to me this is the crucial one, because it says the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Now, is this narrow enough? Does that say it has no power, Parliament doesn't need to listen to it, it can only offer advice? And is it narrow enough in the issues? Because you could say everything up to defence and foreign affairs affects Aboriginal people.
Yeah. Well, look, all it's saying is that you may make representations, right? And lots of people make representations to Parliament. I do it all the time when I'm, giving evidence to a parliamentary inquiry. There's nothing particularly secret about it, and nor does it mean when I make a representation in a submission to a parliamentary committee, nor does it mean that anyone has to actually enact or do what I say. Same here. They can make representations. And the point of the exercise, and this is what people really need to understand, is that the whole point of the exercise is twofold. One is being recognised by being heard and having the respect that that involves, right? And the second is making sure that Parliament is informed, because we want Parliament to be informed about Indigenous matters before it makes a decision.
Yes, but the realistic...
say that's a bad thing. I mean, having an informed Parliament has to be good, surely.
Good. I support it as well, but I want to make sure they're very clear about what's happening to the Constitution here, because the critics, and I would agree with constitutional conservatives, you want to make sure you don't give this power, deliberately or not, this body any more powers than people want. So that's very clear about make representations. Let me look at the third clause, the third and final clause then. And this is where it says that the Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to the composition and functions and powers and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Functions, powers and procedures. Now, my question is this. Does that give Parliament carte blanche, or does the previous clause saying make representations limit the power that any voice would have to only making representations?
No, it means Parliament could give it extra functions and powers, but what Parliament couldn't do would be to take away the ability of this body to make representations to Parliament, because that's set in the second provision, right? So you can't take that away, but you can add to it if you want. So you could, say that the voice body can do X, Y, and Z, it can talk to the states or do other sorts of things if you want. But in the end, it's always up to Parliament to decide. And that's really important because it's democratic.
Yeah, I agree that that's absolutely, it's clear there that Parliament has the power, and that's who we want to have the power, because they're the people we elect as a government. But I had a debate about the voice with Andrew Bolt on his show last week, and this is a point he picked up on. Let me show you what he had to say about this clause.
Parliament can give this voice powers and functions, and we're not told what. A future Parliament could say, well, listen, we're going to give you spending powers. We could give you the function of ruling particular parts of Australia. You've got no way of knowing what a future Parliament, what powers and functions it will give to this voice.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, isn't it, Professor? Because with the word powers in there, if a government decided to, with the support of the Senate, of course, could they give this body the power to allocate funding, to raise funding, to do other things?
Okay, so the answer here is yes and no. So first thing to point out is, to the extent that you can give powers to this body, well, you've already got power in your Parliament to do precisely that anyway. So if you legislated a voice, for example, you would have legislative power to do this anyway. So you're not putting anything scary in the Constitution that isn't already there in relation to powers. So that's the first thing to say.
Let me just clarify that, because I think that's important, because just for our viewers, because that under Section 5126 now, under the race power, the government has the power. It could legislate a body like this with any powers it liked anyway.
It could. It could legislate tomorrow to create this voice to Parliament, and it could give it powers and functions that it chose, right? But what it can't do, and this is where it does come into this issue that Andrew Bolt was raised, is it can't say, for example, that this particular body could take away Parliament's legislative powers somehow,
no, it's subordinate.
Override the democratic system. The Constitution itself would stop that from happening, because the whole rest of the Constitution is still there. So it couldn't impose taxes because it's Parliament that imposes taxes. So there are still those democratic systems there, and that word powers in there is not giving it any greater power to that extent than actually already exists in the race power.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks for explaining all that to us, Professor. No doubt we'll have you on again as the debate continues.
You're welcome.
Professor Anne Twomey there, constitutional law expert from Sydney University.